Hello, and welcome back to the Cup That Cheers. I'm Elizabeth, and today we are starting our series, the long promised series of videos on hand sewing, the individual stitches, the 4 individual stitches that I taught my students when I taught this as a person to person class. And I had them practice the stitches while making a stitch sampler. So when you're learning new stitches, again, you're going to need to practice. This sampler, this stitch sampler, should be your first hand sewing project. And it doesn't have to look good, so don't worry about it. You're just training your hands and your eyes and your brain to work together to move the needle in the way that you want it to go. Again, for a sampler, free fabric is always best to use. It's like your scratch paper when you're doing a math problem in school. So this is an old bed sheet that I have ripped to size. It's about, let's see, how wide is it actually? This is 8 inches wide because I actually got this out to use to make masks, and that was the measurement I was using. You can use any scrap of fabric. For my students, I had them measure out a 12-inch square. Actually, I measured out a 12-inch square of old bedsheet fabric for them and cut it out. The piece of fabric you use for your sampler needs to be big enough that you can do more than just a few stitches of each type of stitch on the fabric. You need to really practice. And it needs to be small enough to be easily held in the hand, easily spread out on a table and not take up too much space, and to be able to be put away easily. So, piece of woven fabric that's free. One thing about woven fabric is that you can actually rip it to size rather than have to cut it. For your sampler, having perfectly straight edges is not necessary. For the projects that you do, garments or something that someone is going to be seeing, then if the pattern calls for a straight edge, it needs to be perfectly straight. If the pattern calls for a curved edge, it needs to be a smooth curve. It needs to not be jagged. And so one way that you get straight edges, this does not work for curved edges. It only works for straight edges, and it only works on firm, tightly woven fabric. You can rip fabric along one of the thread lines in the fabric. So fabric is woven, which means that basically half of the threads go up and down, half the threads go at a 90-degree angle to them, perpendicular to them. And you can rip a straight line along either those threads or those threads going in that direction. So what you do is you look for the thread, the point where you want to rip. So I'm going to go ahead and make this about 12 inches wide, a little less than 12 inches wide. And I'm going to mark where I want to rip by making a slit, a small cut. When you're ripping, if you're ripping through the selvage, which is this thicker part at the edge, you need to cut through that. That won't rip. But once you've cut through that, the rest of it will. And then you just put your hands on either side of the little snip that you made, and you're going to move your hands straight to the side at the same rate. Don't pull less on one side than you do on the other. You just like that. And you do get a bit of fraying, but you end up with a perfectly straight edge. It might be a little bit gathered up. You might have to sort of snap it like that and pull it, but you end up with a perfectly straight edge because it has literally ripped all of the threads going in one direction right along one of the threads going in the other direction. So this works well on woven cotton. and tightly woven linen. And you can even do this with silk taffeta. Now, I'm a bit scared to do this with silk taffeta, but silk taffeta is of a texture that is very tightly woven and firm, and you can rip it. Okay, so when you're making your stitch sampler, you're going to need, of course, the fabric, you're going to need some thread, you're going to need a needle, you're going to need some beeswax, you're going to need some scissors, and you're going to need a ruler and pencil. So, first things first. The ruler and pencil are to make lines on your fabric for you to follow with the stitches. This is not as simplistic as it seems, because if you've not done this before, what you're doing when you make your stitch sampler is not only training your eyes and your brain and your hands to work together in making the stitches, and not just learning how to make the shape of the stitches, but learning how to make your hands and your eyes and the needle follow a straight line without having it be traced on the fabrics. So then you're going to need to thread your needle. So it doesn't really matter what kind of needle you get. It's just make sure you have one that is small enough to be comfortable and small enough to go easily through the fabric. So you just test it, and if you can push it through the fabric without too much trouble, it's fine. You're also going to need to cut a length of thread. Now, I think I discussed this in the thread video, the video that talked about thread being one of the necessary tools that you need for your sewing kit. And you're going to take it off the spool, and the length of the thread that you're going to cut is the length of your arm. So you just kind of hold the spool in your hand, and you can't see the end of the fabric or end of the thread, but you just pull it till the end of the thread is on your shoulder. Then you get your scissors and you snip the thread, and you're going to thread your needle. Now, I think I also talked about this in the video where we were talking about needles, but you're just going to hold the needle up with the eye or the hole on the needle on the top, and you're going to put your thread through. But you're going to go ahead and pull that end of the thread through the needle and leave, I don't know, a couple inches of it just hanging to give yourself a fairly long working end of thread. So you're going to be sewing on this part of the thread. This part of the thread is excess. That is just like an extra length of thread that you're going to use as your sewing uses up more and more and more of the working end of the thread and gets closer and closer to this excess end of thread. And you'll need to sort of pull it to both give yourself more of a working end of the thread and to get this little end, this little tail out of the way. And that also helps keep it on the needle. Then next thing you're going to do is you're going to wax your sewing thread. Just pull it over the wax 2 times. That should be enough. And then you're going to tie a knot on the end of your thread. So you have the long working end of your thread that you're going to actually be sewing with at the beginning. You're going to pinch it between your thumb and forefinger, wrap it around your forefinger, once, and try to get the two ends to cross. And then you're going to make the knot by kind of pressing with your thumb and pressing it against the thread and rolling it up, twisting it around itself as you push it off the end of your forefinger. So it looks kind of like that. Then, see how it's kind of twisted? Then you're going to grab it and press the thread between your thumbnail and your first finger. And with your other hand, pull the thread. And that sort of squashes all that twisted thread down to the end where it gets tangled up and where it gets knotted. So that is a knot. There are other ways of fastening your thread to make a little smaller knot, but when you're just beginning, a big knot is fine. All right, so now that you've got your needle ready, the first stitch that you're going to practice is the running stitch. So first thing is I'm going to turn the fabric around so it's easier for me to hold, is you're going to hold your fabric with your non-dominant hand underneath the fabric and your thumb over the edge. If you're right-handed, that means you're holding the fabric with your left hand and you're holding the needle with your right hand. If you're left-handed, it's going to be the other way around. You're also going to start on the end of the line that is nearest to your dominant hand. So again, if you're right-handed, that's the right hand end of the line that you're going to follow. If you're left-handed, it's going to be the left hand end of the line. Okay, so you're going to start by putting the needle underneath the fabric and poking the needle through the fabric right on, exactly on that line, and pulling it through. And that brings that knot that you just tied up to the very surface of the back of the fabric, or the underside of the fabric. And when we're talking about sewing fabric, we have a right side of the fabric and a wrong side of the fabric. The back or the underside of the fabric is called the wrong side. The top or the above surface of the fabric, if the fabric had a design or print, that would be the side of the fabric where that was most visible. That's the right side of the fabric. So your stitches, the only place where it matters where they look is on the right side of the fabric. The back side of the fabric, the wrong side of the fabric, can be full of knots and tangles, and it doesn't actually matter. Okay, so now you're ready to start doing the running stitch. And the running stitch, basically, the thread comes up through the fabric from the wrong side, turns over and goes back right down through the right side of the fabric to the wrong side again. Ideally, in an ideal world, your running stitches would be equally spaced apart and of equal size. And in the Victorian and Edwardian dressmaking and sewing manuals, they talk about making your running stitches about 2 to 3 threads long. That means you have to be able to see the individual threads that the fabric is woven out of and count 1 or 2 or 3 of them. And the space that those 3 threads take is the amount of space that your the size that your stitches should be. On this fabric, it's probably about that big. That's a teeny, teeny, tiny stitch. I don't make my stitches that small. I make my stitches more like that size. When you're starting out, you can make them that size. Whatever is easiest for you to see and for you to do. And as you get more comfortable with the stitch, you can make them smaller. So you have the beginning of the stitch is where the thread is coming out. You put the needle in, and then before you pull it through, you move the needle so that it is now in line with that line that you just drew. And you can sort of see where the point of the needle is underneath the fabric. And with my left hand, I have my middle finger of my left hand on the end of the needle, pressing it back up to the fabric. And I'm also kind of bending the fabric down with my thumb. And I'm going to find where the point is and make it come through the fabric right on that line, the same distance away as where it went in, so that the stitch is going to begin where the thread is, it's going to end where this part of the needle is, the next stitch is going to begin where this part of the point of the needle just came through. So once you've done that, you pull the thread, and sometimes it gets caught, but that's not a big deal. And then you've made your stitch and you've started the next one. And this stitch is about the same length as this space. And what you're going to work on is you're just going to work on getting the spacing even and the size even, and also following that line. And you're just going to keep doing that until you reach the end of the line that you drew. Now, once you get comfortable with stitching one stitch at a time like that, you can do something that I call stacking your stitches. I don't know if that's the actual term for it, but that's what I call it. And that is when you do more than one stitch, or you start more than one running stitch at a time, and then you finish all of them together. This is what I mean by that. So you have your needle going through, coming out on the line. Before you actually use your fingers to push the needle all the way through, pick it up and pull it through, you do it again. Okay, so now there's 2 stitches on the needle ready to be completed. Depending on how long your needle is, can fit maybe one more stitch just barely on this needle. 1, 2, 3 stitches. And then you use either your index finger or your middle finger to push it through. And the reason why I call it stacking the stitches is because when you do this part, it gathers up the fabric and it's like those 3 stitches are stacked on one another. And then you pull the thread through, give yourself some more thread, to complete all 3 stitches all together. So hopefully you were able to see that. Another thing to practice when you are doing your running stitch is thread tension. So when you pull the thread through, just pull it through just enough so that it lies flat. If you pull, so you're holding the fabric, if you pull the thread too much, that's what happens. If you are not making a gathering stitch, which is one of the variations of the running stitch, you don't want that to happen with the fabric. So if you see the fabric starting to bunch up, put it down on the table or surface and stroke the fabric with your fingers just to get everything nice and smooth and flat again before you continue. All right, so now we are at the end of the line of stitching. Okay, and again, we want this side to look good. This is the right side of the fabric. So we're going to put the needle through to the underside. And you can even make a little extra half of a stitch there along the line. pull it through to the other side of the fabric, and we're going to make a knot in the thread that will keep the thread from going back through, pulling back through the fabric. So the way I taught my students to do it was to take 2 fingers of their left hand, if you're right-handed, your non-dominant hand, and wrap the thread around it, and then cross that last end of the fabric over the thread and tuck it into the loop and pull. Now, if you take your fingers out of the thread and you pull the thread, that's what happens. The knot is over here. It's supposed to be over there, right on top of the fabric. So the way you keep it in place is you keep your fingers inside and you spread them out a little bit. And can you see what's happening? That part where the knot's going to be is right on top of the fabric. And so as you pull, you get it right on top of the fabric, and then you have one finger in the loop and the thumbnail holding that knot down, and then you can take your finger out and pull. Oops, it got caught on that first knot that I tied. And pull the thread, keeping your finger right where the knot's supposed to be. And then when you've pulled the thread all the way, the knot is right there. Thanks for joining me as we were talking about the running stitch, the simplest stitch in the sewing repertoire that I taught to my students. Please join me next time as we will be talking about the next stitch in the series of stitches that I taught my students, and that will be the back stitch. It's an extremely useful stitch for dressmaking, and there are a few different variations of the back stitch as well. So please come on back. I look forward to any comments or feedback that you would like to leave in the comments section below. Please click like if you liked this video. Subscribe if you'd like to see any more videos in this series, or in the historic cooking series, or in the antiques series that I think I'm going to be starting, where you take a look at various antique items in my collection, because I do have a small collection of antique books and antique garments, and photographs, and antique fashion prints, fashion plates that that we can take a look at if you are interested in seeing that. So everybody stay safe. We're continuing with the lockdown, so practicing your stitches is a good thing to do that you can do indoors. Everybody stay safe and healthy.